Hello, everyone. Wishing you all a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you joining in from across the world. And I welcome you all to today's webinar on Power BI interview questions. So the idea is to, over the next 1 hour or so, the idea is to walk you through some of the most commonly asked interview questions in Power BI. So we're going to be focusing on a lot of conceptual topics, a lot of theoretical questions, and a lot of practical questions. And the idea is to not only walk you through the questions, but also to actually take you through a very, very good demonstration and just to give you a very good approach and idea on how to answer some of those questions. Okay. So I'll try to connect a lot of these questions to real life scenarios so that when you're asked a question next time in your interview, you're not only giving out a theoretical answer, but you're actually able to connect with practical examples and use cases and stuff like that. So we're going to try to make it as broad as possible. And obviously, the idea here is we have picked up a very, very limited set of questions, but it's a pretty good and some of the most important questions that we have picked up for this specific webinar. So first of all, we have broken it down into a few general subtopics. So first of all, I'll be focusing on a few general Power BI questions. And obviously, what is self-service business intelligence? So needless to say, Power BI, the very fact is that Power BI is one of the most popular SSBI tools in the marketplace today. And any of you who have worked on other BI tools coming from the world of Tableau or 𝐶𝐿 or Spotfire, you can also relate to this. So if you are asked a question, what is self-service BI? I think the first approach to take is to explain what is SSBI. Okay. Now, any of you, as I said, if you have come from the world of traditional business intelligence, right? If you have worked on tools like SSRS, Cognos, if you come from MSBI world, or if you've used the business objects, you typically have used tools where it's not exactly built for end users, right? So essentially building reports or building any kind of project used to take a lot of time. Obviously for developers, it's a very easy tool to use. But if you think of end users, at the end of the day, if you think of the business users or the end users or non-technical people would find it very, very difficult to use something like, say, a Visual Studio to develop MSBI SSRS reports. Okay, so that's the world of traditional BI, where development cycles were long and there's a big hindrance, right? So if business users want answers to certain questions, let's say if a mutual fund manager wants to know how has my fund performed over the last 10 years in a form of a very simple line chart, that mutual fund manager has to go back and depend on his internal IT team to go back and build that chart for him. It could be a very simple line chart, but as I said, the mutual fund manager may not be that well versed in a traditional BI tool like an SSRS. Okay, so they will be depending on the internal in-house IT team, and that way the overall process will become pretty slow because the IT team will have their own requirement gathering process. They'll have their own software development framework which they'll follow, and probably a very simple activity which would ideally have taken less than 10 seconds to build, right? On paper, line chart is so simple, but then it could easily take 2 to 3 weeks depending on a lot of factors. So this is exactly where self-service BI comes in. And self-service BI is an approach to data analytics that enables business users to filter, segment, and analyze their data. And this is the key, where the key is really to focus on business users. And you can either say business users or you can say end users, customers. So essentially non-technical people who are the real consumers of this particular tool. Okay. And what is the benefit of using this? And if you just compare to the scenario I discussed just a while back, now here the mutual fund manager can directly use a tool called Power BI, and he can directly connect to the data. He can directly build the line chart all by himself. Okay, so obviously the development cycle will be much faster, and the business user will be happier because he has control of his data. He has control of exactly what he is seeing, and he's not dependent on any external team. Okay, so it's a win-win approach. It's a win-win approach. The end user is happy. The IT team is also happy because sometimes what happens in traditional BI projects, especially if there is a requirement involved, typically in requirement gathering phases, as we have all encountered, right? There are so many iterations that take place, right? You do requirement gathering, you do one phase of requirement gathering, and then something misses, something gets missed, and you come back, you build a product, and the customer is not happy with the product. So you go back and build it again, you iterate over it, right? So those kind of problems can crop up, especially in traditional approaches. But that is something that's completely out of the picture in an SSBI approach because the business user himself or herself is building the report, and there is no question on dependency, and whatever they want, they are building. So essentially, it's a win-win situation. And as I said, it's a very easy process, and anybody who has basic understanding of data can create reports to build intuitive and shareable dashboards. So when you answer this question, it's very important to give the basic understanding of what are the challenges of traditional BI, what are the challenges of some of the other top BI tools, and where does SSBI fit in? It shouldn't be a very bland answer, just that what is SSBI and that Power BI is an SBI tool, but try to be as broad as possible. Try to give context on where SSBI comes from, why is SSBI important, and what are some of the other tools. Remember, Power BI is a very small part of the whole landscape. The BI landscape is dominated by tools like Tableau, like Spotfire, like 𝐶𝐿 in the data visualization SSBI landscape. And if you talk about SSBI in analytics, there's also tools like Alteryx, which are really revolutionary. And you can take these examples, and that will really get to show your depth and breadth of knowledge in the entire BI space. Okay, so moving on. Next question, what are the parts of Microsoft Self-Service BI solution? So as I mentioned, the SSBI question in the beginning was purely a very general question. Now we are being more focused on Microsoft stack. So we are focused on the entire Microsoft stack. And obviously when you talk about the Microsoft stack, we are talking about primarily two toolkits here. So one is obviously the Excel BI toolkit and the other is the Power BI toolkit. Okay, now some of you might be wondering, why am I using Excel BI toolkit? So if this question is asked to you in the interview, what do you actually say? Do you actually mention Excel BI? Do you mention Power BI? Because obviously we are discussing Power BI. So it's natural we'll be talking about Power BI, but it is also very, very important that you mention Excel BI, because remember, Power BI is nothing but an extension of the Excel add-in components, right? So if any of you have worked in Excel, and I'm assuming all of you have worked in Excel, and I don't mean to say working in Excel in a spreadsheet application. So obviously Excel is a spreadsheet application. We have, all of us have used it. Even if we don't, even if we say that we don't work in Excel, all of us have seen Excel spreadsheets, right? But what I really mean to say is Excel from the standpoint of some of its add-in components, some of its add-in components like the Power BI components of Excel, like Power Query, Power Pivot, Power View. And when you think about these components, what are they? They are actually helping you build BI solutions right within Excel. Now, I know it comes as a surprise for many people initially to believe that Power BI actually came from Excel, but that is the truth. When you think about the origins of Power BI, when you think about how Power BI came into existence, it came into existence from Excel. So whatever you have in Power BI is nothing new, right? So all these components have already been there in Excel for a long time. Okay, so when you think of Power Pivot was actually launched as an add-in. Okay, when you think of Power Query, again, Power Query was launched way back. Power View is again a very, very integral component of Excel. So all these components were already existing in Excel. And all that Power BI Desktop did was it repackaged all these components, which they now call Power BI Desktop. Okay, but it is very important to understand that they were all already there. So the obvious question that I sometimes face from candidates is, why did Power BI build a tool like that? Why did I build a tool like that? If Excel had already had this component, then why not use Excel? And the challenge was that, and this is, I'm sure most of you who have actually worked in these tools would have faced similar challenges, is in Excel you have so many different versions. If you, especially if you use a 2013, 2010 version, 2016 version, and within each version there are so many different editions. And then the other thing is that these add-in tools are not exactly part of Excel. There are different releases. You have to separately add them. You have to install updates. So all those challenges are there. So if you're migrating, if you're moving from one edition to another edition, the compatibility issues crop up. So all those problems used to happen with this particular stack. In fact, as I told you, and as I'll show you in some of the upcoming discussions, that all these components, the behavior of these components are exactly the same. When you compare the Excel BI components and when you compare the Power BI components, that is the Power BI desktop components, they are exactly the same. There is no difference at all. Okay, barring a few very, very minute differences, they borrow most of the features, right? However, as I said, the idea of using the Power BI desktop was to package it in one single solution tool and present it to end users, which is just much neater. It's just much easier to use. And overall, it's just a good solution. It's just a clean solution that Microsoft has built. Okay, so again, coming to the question, it's very important that you mention about Excel BI, because most people will actually go back and say, okay, Microsoft self-service BI to solution will only be Power BI, which is obviously that's Power BI interview. So you'll actually say only Power BI, but actually it's no. So you should mention that it actually came from Excel. And Excel, by the way, is also a very, very powerful self-service BI solution, because remember, even without the Power BI components of Excel, even without these Excel components like Power Query, Power View, or Power Pivot, think of a very, very simple use case where you have a simple spreadsheet application. A business manager has a very, very simple spreadsheet application, and he has some data on an Excel spreadsheet, and all he wants to do is create a very, very simple chart out of it. Can he not use the charts function in Excel? Answer is yes, right? All he will do is he will connect to his Excel data. He can simply create either a pivot table or he can create a pivot chart, and he can analyze that particular data right within Excel. And I'm not even talking about Power Query, Power Pivot, and Power View. I'm talking about simply creating pivot tables and pivot charts in Excel, which you can do without using any of these components, right? And when I mentioned about that particular use case, what the business manager is actually doing is that business manager is actually performing self-service BI, right? He's performing self-service BI right within Excel. Okay. Moving on, what is Power BI Desktop? Obviously, Power BI Desktop is the free desktop application, and typically this question can sound a very, very generic question, and they just want to test out your overall understanding of the tool that we are obviously going to do much of our development in, which is the Power BI Desktop tool. So it is very important to, a few keywords are very, very important. One is obviously it is a desktop application. One other keyword that I would really like all of you to use is the client tool. It is a client tool. Okay, remember Power BI, the entire architecture of Power BI is a client server architecture, where you have the Power BI desktop, which is sitting in the middle as a client tool. So Power BI desktop is where you actually do all your development stuff. Okay, that is where you actually build your reports. You actually build all the cool visuals. You actually build your model right inside Power BI desktop. and then you publish it onto the cloud, which we call the Power BI service. So remember, it's a client server architecture. So mention those words, mention those keywords, mention those terms. And the other thing that you should also mention is, and again, as I said, when asked a question on what is Power BI desktop, just focus a bit on the entire architecture generally. Okay, so they may want to know what is a desktop, but if you talk about the service, that just goes to show that you're overall having a pretty good breadth of knowledge. And just give them a picture. Just give them a picture. Don't mention about all the components, but just mention about what is the desktop and the service. At least mention about the desktop and the service generally. Okay. And I think this is also a very, very key part, the second point, where we are saying that Power BI desktop works cohesively with the Power BI service. And as I mentioned here, just mention the part that this is the client and it's the server essentially. Okay. What are the Power BI components? And this is again a very, very important question, and it's more of a follow-up to this initial question. So sometimes they might want to ask a more specific question like what is Power BI desktop? And remember, when I ask this question, you should focus on desktop and the service. But now this is a much more broad-based question where they want to know your detailed knowledge on Power BI. What do you understand about the entire ecosystem of Power BI? And this is what the complete architecture is all about, right? You can see that it consists of Power Query, Power Pivot, Power View. These are obviously the add-in components. Okay. These are the Power components. Then you have Power Map, Data Management Gateway. Power BI Q&A is another revolutionary feature, natural language querying, which I'll just talk about in a while. And finally, Power BI Service. Okay. So mainly theoretical. What I would suggest is just give them a picture, just give them the names of these 8 components, and just give them an idea of what each of these components mean. Okay. So if asked a question like this, just focus on Power BI. Again, when asked a question like this, just focus on Power BI. Give a very, very brief description about Power BI. Probably you can just probably mention Power BI is a self-service BI tool, and it has obviously these are the main components. You have the Power Query, Power Pivot, Power View, and all these 3 are part of Power BI Desktop. So all these 3 you can just club it as part of Power BI Desktop. And then your Power Map, which also is a part of Power BI Desktop. And then finally your Data Catalog, Management Gateway, Power BI Q&A, and Power BI Service, which are obviously the service components. Okay. Obviously, there are a few things which keep changing in the overall ecosystem. So remember, one thing you have to understand in Power BI is that the product is very, very frequently updated. So for instance, the Power BI Desktop gets updated every month. So every month Power BI Desktop, it shoots out the releases every month. And the Power BI Service, which obviously lives on the cloud, that shoots out updates like every week or probably multiple times a week. Okay, there are new features getting added every single time. And the reason why I mentioned this is because of the Q&A feature. Remember, Q&A feature for a long time has been on the service. And I just mentioned a while back the Q&A feature is in the service. It is still in the service, but then in the desktop, it has very recently been included as a preview feature. Okay, so when you talk about these things, if you have an understanding of what are the recent updates, what are the recent releases that are coming from the Power BI stack, if you keep yourself updated with what is the January updates, what are the December updates, and if you understand this, the length and breadth of everything that's happening in the Power BI landscape, I think that will just add more value to your responses and the answers to the questions that you give. So just as an example for this particular question, if you're talking about Power BI Q&A, one thing I will recommend is just mention that it's a service component, but also mention that of late Power BI has included that as part of the Power BI Desktop. Okay, so now you can actually go to Power BI Desktop and you can shoot Q&A features directly from there. And I know I haven't talked a lot about this yet, but I'll just quickly connect to my data here in Power BI. And as you can see, I'm just connected. This is my Power BI Desktop interface that I've opened. Okay, and I can very easily connect to my Excel file. See how easy it is to connect to an Excel file here from Power BI Desktop directly. And I will very easily connect to my Excel file from here. I'll just load this data. And now you get a very simple interface from where I can choose the sheet names. So this is an Excel workbook where I have 3 worksheets: orders, people, and returns. I'll select the order sheet. Okay, the edit is basically for opening up the query editor. If you click on edit, it will open up the query editor where you can edit your queries. Okay, and this is basically what you're going to get. You're going to get data in your Power Pivot model, and now you can go back and visualize your data. Okay, so if I want to, so remember the example of that fund manager, where the fund manager wants to see how much profit he has got based on every day. You can see how easily, just with 3 clicks, he can generate a very, very nice line chart. Okay, and you can see how easily we can build dashboards in Power BI. Okay, and how powerful it is as a self-service BI tool. Okay, and just to come back to the question on Q&A feature, and by the way, the preview features are turned on in Power BI Desktop in this particular thing. You can go to File, Options and Settings, go to Options, and you can see all the preview features will be listed out here. Go to Preview Features, and you can see all the preview features listed out here. You can see I have turned on all the features except Spanish because I don't know Spanish, so I can't turn this on, right? All right. So these are all the preview features, and if you just double click on it, see something called Q&A is listed out here, and you can just double click on this particular thing, and you should be able to see that a very, very familiar Q&A feature which comes up in the service. That exact same thing is now built into the desktop. Okay, and I will talk more about the service later on, guys, but just to bring this up as an answer to this question, I just wanted to quickly cover this with all of you. So you can just double click on this and you can ask questions. You can ask some question like, sales by region, Pretty cool, huh? I'm just typing it, and if I want to see it as a pie chart, I can just say as a pie chart. Okay, so just by typing, I can see exactly what I want to look at, and it gives you some suggestions. It's more of a gives you some suggestions here as and when you type the values, and you can see if I look at a matrix, want to see this as a different kind of visual, let's say as a table. It gives me all these options. Okay, so that's the Q&A feature that is built right inside the Power BI desktop as a preview feature. And when you answer this question, the other important thing that I do want to mention here is just giving a brief description about all these components. Remember, guys, Power Query is the ETL component of Power BI desktop. So that's an ETL component. So the idea in Power Query is you're taking your data, you're connecting to various sources, and you're performing a very, very basic ETL operation there inside Power Query, right? So the idea is to just perform basic data cleansing operations, because remember, data from the source is never in the right shape. It's never in the right format, okay? It's what we call dirty data. So data from the source is always dirty. So you want to always clean it, okay? You want to always clean it. You want to perform some basic transformations before you use it for your actual analysis, okay? So that is the very, very first step in Power Query. Okay, so if you remember, what I've done as the very first step in Power BI is I connected to my Excel file, right? And typically, the way to open up Query Editor is either you can click on Edit Queries here, or you could have clicked on Edit in that particular dialog box I got just a while back. You could have directly clicked on Edit there. Okay, so click on Edit Queries here, and once you do that, it will open up the Query Editor where you can go ahead and edit your query. Okay, you can go ahead and perform basic ETL operations. Obviously, there's a lot that is here. We're not going to cover everything, but at a basic level, this is just for you to understand. Just to give you some context as to what this interface is all about. Okay, and just a simple example, you can probably give some simple examples here where, let's say, you want to you're looking at the orders table and you don't want to look at all this data, so you were removing some columns. Let's say here you're going to go and remove all these columns. You don't need all these columns, so you want to remove the ship date. So you don't care about ship date, you don't care about customer ID. And see, whenever I perform any kind of operation here, whether it's a remove column or if I do an add column, just here I can also go back and do an add column. So I can actually just come back here and I can add a column. I can add a custom column. It's just like adding a calculated column. Okay, so I can add a column called cost, and cost is going to be equal to sales minus profit. Okay, and that gets added as a calculated column, and that again gets added as a step. So everything in a query is basically a step. Okay, so mention these keywords that you build queries, query editor, and behind the scenes you're creating steps. So mention these pieces when you're talking about this particular answer, and also mention data types. Very, very important part, setting data types properly. Okay, you can see what's happening here is when I build that particular column called cost, so this becomes loosely typed. It's not exactly in the correctly typed format. Okay, ABC123 basically means that it's not properly typed. So you have to go back and specifically set the type to decimal number. Okay, these are all the data types that are available in Power BI desktop. And so that's it. That's all I have. And what I will do now is, once I'm happy with whatever changes I've done, let's say I've performed all my data cleansing and data transformation activities, I can go back and close and apply. And once I do that, what will happen is data will get loaded into my Power Pivot data model. You can see what happens here. It is going to get loaded into my Power Pivot data model. Okay, so the first step is Power Query, where you will perform the ETL. And the next step is from Power Query, the data goes to Power Pivot. And Power Pivot is nothing but an in-memory columnar database where your data gets loaded. Okay, that's your data model. In other words, we call it a data model. So the idea is that you perform your ETL, you clean your data, and then you load your data into the Power Pivot model. Okay, and from there, you're going to visualize your data using Power View. Okay, that's the very, very basic process that we have in the Power BI desktop. The same as we have in Excel. Okay, even if you use the Excel BI components, it'll pretty much be the same thing. And just to give you a brief glimpse of that, I'll not talk a lot about it. I've opened up my Excel. Remember, I have opened up my Excel, but I also have the add-in components loaded. So I'm using 2016 version of Excel, by the way. So it's very, very easy to do the same thing in Excel as well. So you can go to get data, you can go to file. You see the interface is very similar to what you have in Power BI desktop, which is why I actually drawn those parallels in the beginning of our discussion where I said that both these components draw so much from each other. Okay, I'll connect with that same Excel file here. Click on import. It's connecting. I'll get the same interface where I can connect to that particular worksheet from that workbook. It is still establishing a connection. The same interface, a very, very similar kind of interface opens up just a while back what we saw in Power BI desktop. It is taking a bit of time to load. And the idea is that the idea behind showing you this thing is just so that you're mentioning these things when you're asked this question, so that you get an idea that, okay, the same thing you can do in Excel as well, what you can do in Power BI desktop. I'll just quickly go ahead and expand it. I'll select my orders table from here, and you can see the very, very similar options are coming up: load, edit. It'll open up the query editor very similarly how it opened up in my Power BI desktop. Okay, so you can processing my queries. The concept of queries is very similar to what we saw in the desktop, and you can see it's opening up the query editor. And again, here you can see that the interface is very, very similar to what we saw in Power BI desktop. Remember, it's very easy to confuse that I'm actually opening up Excel, but this is actually Excel. It's not Power BI desktop. Okay, so I can do the same stuff I performed just a while back in Power BI Desktop, I can go back and remove my columns. I can remove my order date, a row ID, see the steps are getting added. I can add the custom column, go to add column, custom column. I can do pretty much the same stuff here. Okay, I can add that cost column, which is going to be sales minus profit. Click on OK, custom column added. And now we can go back to home and say close and load to. Okay. And when you're closing and loading, essentially what happens is you're loading that whole stuff into your model. Okay. And which is nothing but the Power Pivot. All right, so it's very, very important that you have this understanding that Power BI Desktop is not to be learned in isolation. It's not to be learned in isolation, but you should have an appreciation of the fact that behind the scenes is nothing but Excel in action. Okay, so whenever you're asked any kind of questions on the entire architecture of Power BI or the components of Power BI, it is very, very important that you link it to Excel and you give them a very, very concise and holistic answer of what you can do in Power BI Desktop and what you can do in Excel and how similar they are overall. Okay, so that's about Power Query, Power View, Power Pivot, and Power Map. Power Map is another add-in component in Excel, and essentially Power Maps are leveraged pretty much the same way within Power BI Desktop as well, using the very, very powerful mapping feature here that you have. Okay, you can build some very, very cool maps directly from the Power BI Desktop. Okay, and essentially you can do some pretty cool stuff in the Power Maps feature as well that you have within the Excel add-ins. Okay. We have data catalog. Data catalog is basically Azure data catalog, so it's pretty helpful for connecting to different sources, management of different sources. You have data management gateway, which is used for connecting to on-premises data. Another very, very essential component is something that you set up in the service level. So if you go to the Power BI service, basically, so whatever you see I have right now is what I call the Power BI service. So remember, guys, I talked about this in the initial session, beginning of the session, where I said, this is my client development tool. Okay, this is Power BI Desktop. It's a client development tool. This is where I build my stuff. And after I build my stuff, I publish it onto what I call the service. And just to give you a quick demonstration of that, just to give you a very, very quick demonstration of that, I'll build a very, very simple line chart here. And I'll just go ahead and name this as, I'll just give it a name. Okay, probably I'll go ahead and name it as demo. I'll save it and call it demo. That's my demo Power BI report. Remember, Power BI reports get saved with the file name extension of PBIX. That's another very important interview question. They tend to ask you what are the different extension types, and it's not only with Power BI files. They actually something called template files also, which I call Power BI template file. This PBIT. Remember, there's two types of extensions. PBIX stands for the Power BI file, that is the Power BI analysis file, and PBIT, which stands for the Power BI template file. Okay, so I'll save it with the name demo. Click on save. Remember, for publishing, it is very important that you're signed in. And once you're signed in, once everything else is set up, you can just go back and save it in your workspace. And once you've done that, you can just go to the service and check that your stuff has been published. Okay, like something very similar will be visible on your service, and you can look at the report section where you can see that has been published. This respective report has been published. And remember, this is the cloud environment. Okay, so this is my development tool. That's my development environment. That's my client. And this is the cloud environment, which is my server. Okay, I published my stuff here. And now all my end users can view my reports and dashboards from here. Okay, so from here, I can further create what I call dashboards. And then I can go to my dashboard and say, share my dashboard. I can go to share. And then I'll mention with whom all I want to share my dashboard and give the email IDs of all the folks I want to share my dashboards with. One very important thing to remember that in Power BI, you can only share stuff with everyone in your organization. So for instance, if you look at this link, this is where you can simply go ahead and specifically give access to who all you want to share it with. Just start typing the email addresses that you want to send them, and automatically they'll receive email notifications, or they will basically get notifications on their Power BI service interface, which is basically the tab here. It's a notifications tab that you basically have here. Okay, so very easy, very simple, very intuitive process overall. And just mention these pieces when you're talking about it. And again, it just goes to show the overall depth of knowledge that you have in the tool if you mention all these different components taken together while you answer these questions. Okay, what are the sources that Power BI can connect to? Actually, there is infinite. Okay, so ideally there are a lot of sources Power BI can connect to. If you go to get data, this is only from the desktop. Okay, from the desktop it can connect to a wide range of sources. So you can go to more, you can just take a look at the available sources that Power BI can connect to. We saw an example with Excel, but you can connect to files, XML, JSON, databases, ton of databases that you have. Okay, and if you don't see anything here, you can obviously set up an ODBC connection. Very easy to set up an ODBC connection also. And online services, this list just keeps growing. Azure services, and it's pretty cool list of services and sources you can connect to. Okay, another very interesting option is web data. Just to give an example on this, you can very easily connect to web data, and I'll take an example of money control. Okay, probably we can go online and I'll search for the website money control. Okay, and this is again to highlight to you how easy it is to connect to web data in Power BI. Okay, so typically it might involve writing a lot of scripts. If you just want to quickly connect to a website and take some tabular data from there, you can skip all the scripting, all that stuff, and just connect to the data generally. Okay, So I'll go ahead and copy that link and paste it, click on OK. And once you do that, it'll try to establish a connection with Money Control. It does take a bit of time initially to set this up. And once it does, what it will do is it'll go to the website and it'll try to look at the website, and remember everything's underlying based on HTML. It'll try to search for tables, anything which is structured as a table. It'll try to search for that kind of data. And once it finds it, it'll present to you a list of all those available tables. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and just type this in once again. So the idea is it does take some time depending on the connection that you have. So I think the site is not working that well right now. So what it's doing is establishing a live connection with that site at this moment. And it'll ideally typically present to you a list of all the tables, tabular structures that you have. And you can see it takes a bit of time to connect to the site. And as you can see, finally, my list has come up. The initial case, there was some issue with the connection, so we were not getting all the tables. And as you can see, very nicely, it will present to me all the tables. So it basically looks at that entire website and will scrape that entire website for any HTML structures that it finds. And you can see very nicely, I get this bonds here. And what is this bonds? If I have to quickly go back and show you in Money Control, I've actually closed that website here. If I just have to show you quickly what that bonds is. So there's a section in that website where I have something very similar to this, and you can see how easily I'm able to get a very nice tabular format out of all this. You can go to web view where you get that website kind of view, or you can directly select your data from here. You can just click on bonds and you can just go ahead and load this table directly into your website, into your Power BI desktop file. Okay. It is loading. It further takes some time because remember, it is taking the data straight from your website. So it does take a bit of time. Just why Money Control site is opened up here. And if you just go down, you can just take a look at this whole piece here. That's the bond section that got loaded. Okay. So very nicely, you can see these are tabular structures, the indexes, global markets. Okay. You have a section on bonds, you have a section on currencies, and Power BI, when it looks at that web data, it is able to very easily scrape through that data. It's very easily able to select that data from here because at the underlying layer, these are all HTML tables. Okay, so mention some of those examples when you talk about this particular question of what it can connect to. It can connect to a wide variety of sources, and that is only in the desktop. If you talk about the service, you can go to get data into service. Okay, and you have a further lots of services you can connect to from here. So just as an example, you can choose content packs. You can obviously connect on to content packs, which are nothing but pre-built and pre-packaged dashboards, we like to call it. Okay, in other words, another name for content packs is what we call apps. So nowadays, apps are a replacement for content packs. You can think of it, and they're nothing but pre-packaged. It's like packaged dashboards, it's like packages. Okay, where you have already built a dashboard, where you have already built in the reports, the data sets, the dashboards, the model, everything, and the end users just consuming it. As an example, what I really like to show you here is something with Bitcoin. Okay, so something with Bing Maps as an example. So let's look at Bing Maps. Let's see if I can find Bing Maps here. Yeah, I have Bing Maps here. So what I can do is I can just get it now. It is just like installing an app from Google Play Store or just installing an app. Okay, and you can see what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to consume that app. Okay, it's like a pre-packaged stuff. All the data sets, everything is built in, and I have to enter a parameter. So Microsoft is asking me for a parameter. So I'll just type in Bitcoin just to see what is the search activity in Bitcoin. And just for those of you who don't know, Bing is a search engine by Microsoft. Okay, it's a search engine just like Google. Click on add, and you can see automatically that dashboard got added. I didn't create it, but that is something that got automatically created. Okay, and that's the reason why I say these are content packs, which are nothing but pre-packaged dashboards which are already built in. And now we can actually see that how people are searching, from where people are searching the most, and obviously US people are searching for Bitcoin the most. Okay, see some news mentioned here. Okay, and top languages. Interestingly, German and French are also pretty high. Okay, see the change, week over week change, how many more people are viewing, and you also get a pretty good line chart here where it actually shows you the activity. Okay, the activity is the last week, and pretty interesting. I mean, on this particular day, there was a big spike. You can see that 24,037 people actually searched for it, and slowly, gradually, people have lost interest. It seems like, okay, not many people are actually viewing it now. So anyways, the idea is to just highlight that there is something called content packs, and remember there are two places where you can connect to data. One is from the desktop, and the other is from the service. Okay, from the service also you get a very robust set of options to connect to data, where you not only can connect to files, databases, you can connect to files from here, OneDrive, local files, you connect to databases, Azure databases, and you can also connect onto services. And further, you can also connect onto your organizational content packs if you're working for an organization, and you can also connect onto any organizational content packs that people in your organization have developed. Okay, so services are basically content packs from online services, typical online services like Bing, Salesforce, and all that. Okay, but then organization is only specific to your organization. So mention this piece as well when you talk about the sources you can connect to. What are the building blocks of Power BI? I believe this is something I've already talked quite a lot about, but when you ask this question, again, as I said, give a very, very broad-based view of the building blocks. And I think I'll really appreciate if you're answering this question as an interviewer, definitely they'll appreciate it if you're giving them a holistic view of the entire architecture, right? So talk about Power Query, talk a little bit about Excel, talk about those main components which we call Power Query, Power Pivot, and Power View. Talk about those components and then come to the building blocks. The building blocks obviously are the data sets, the visualizations, the dashboards, the tiles, which are some of the most fundamental things that you have in Power BI. Just to give you a brief context about what this stuff is. So when you build your stuff in Power BI Desktop, obviously you're working with three main tabs primarily. That is obviously the query editor is where you did your ETL, you loaded your data into the model, and then you come to the data tab. Data tab is where you can actually view your model tables. Okay, so right now I have only two tables. One is the orders table and one is the bonds table. So you can actually view your tables over at the data tab. The relationships tab is again where you can quickly take a look at your underlying table relationships. And finally, the reports tab is where you can take a look at your reports, whatever reports you're building. Okay, and once you publish this stuff, then you come to the service. And the service, you basically have data sets, obviously the underlying model and data along with that, which you've exported out or published to the service. That's your data sets, the reports folder. And from the reports, you build dashboards, those dashboards folder. And also have a component called workbooks, which you can mention. And in dashboards, you further have what we call tiles. Okay, these are called tiles in a dashboard. Okay, as you can see, these are all tiles. Okay, so for instance, here I have created only a single line chart, right? If you look at this particular thing that I published, I created only a single line chart. Now I can opt to add one more visual to my report. So what I can do is I can look at my report here. And another beautiful thing about the service, and again, something that all of you can mention here, is the editing capabilities in the service that Power BI gives you. So you can edit a report straight within the service. So the amazing feature where you get a very, very desktop-like interface right within the service. Remember, however, when you mention this part, do mention that you can't build models and you can't do query editing within the service. You can only edit reports. Okay, so you can only edit reports and you can only work on the visualization layer within the service, right? And here I can opt to build a bar chart where I can look at sales in category wise. Let's say I want to stack this by segment, and I can do that. And you can see how automatically Power BI is able to fit these things into the respective components. And again, it just goes to show the SSBI capabilities, the self-service BI capabilities of Power BI. So if a novice user, if a business user is working on it and they have absolutely no clue, what to put, where to put which component, they can simply click on the fields and Power BI will automatically put them in the respective sections. Okay, this again goes to show the self-service capabilities of Power BI. And I can create multiple pages, of course. Okay, I can create another page where I can build a simple tree map here where I'm showing the category, subcategory, and I'm showing the profits now. And I can build a very simple tree map here. And if I want to saturate it with colors, I can further add some color saturations. Okay, I can further add some color saturation. Let's say I want to saturate this by sales. I can further saturate this by colors. Okay, and now I can go back and remember this, the report that I've edited. So I need to go back and save it. So I need to go back and save this report. And once I do that, it will be directly saved within the service itself. Okay, it will be saved in the service itself. Now, one of the questions that people might ask you at times is they might ask you that so now that I've edited the report in the service, can I go ahead and download the report? And answer is absolutely yes. And again, remember, it's a preview feature. Previously, this was not there. This feature got included after a lot of requests by users. It was a major roadblock generally in the development process, but it's a very, very useful option that you have here. And now that you have saved the report, you can actually go ahead and download a copy of the report in your local machine. Okay, very useful feature. You can download it here. You can also export this to PowerPoint preview. Another very useful feature that you have in the service. You can actually export it to a PowerPoint. Okay, so remember, it won't be as interactive. It won't be an interactive presentation, obviously, but you'll still get a pretty cool view of, an introductory page will be created and the visuals will be there. So it's a pretty decent kind of interface that you will get. Okay, so that's another feature that you actually get in the service. And once you build that report, you can go back and obviously pin that to your existing dashboard. So my dashboard is going to be demo dashboard, which I built. And now in my existing dashboard of demo, if you remember, I now have two visuals. Okay, it says Power BI is ready to download. And now you can see these are the tiles that I have basically. Okay, so hope you all followed this particular discussion where I talked about what are the building blocks in Power BI. Obviously, you'll mention a bit about the components, and then you will talk a little bit about what are the primary building blocks, which are obviously datasets, visuals, reports, dashboards, and tiles. Okay, datasets, visuals. Using visuals, you create reports. Using reports, you create dashboards. And basically, using dashboards, essentially tiles are part of the dashboards. Using reports, you basically create tiles, and using tiles, you create dashboards. Okay, what are different types of filters in Power BI reports? Visual filters, page level filters, report level filters, and drill-through filters are the very, very important question. So typically, the way to answer this question is to go back and take scenarios. Now, what are the scenarios where you will implement each type of filter? So visual level filter obviously is present only in the visual level. So it's only, you can think of it like a report level filter. It's present only in a particular type of report, particular type of chart. Okay, so when you come back here and come back to the desktop, and if you take a look at it, you will see the line chart I built here. What filters panel, you can see visual level filters are applied by default. Okay, and these are going to be by default all the fields that are already a part of the report. Okay, so these are, so if you place another chart here, if you place a bar chart here, for instance, So whatever you do in that line chart will not affect that bar chart. Okay, so if I take a bar chart here and I say region wise sales, and now if I go ahead and filter that region, so remember if I click on the region filter here, I will have a region filter here for the bar chart, and if I go ahead and change that region filter to central, it will not affect the line chart, because as I said, it's visual level filter. So visual level filters are, in short, they are specific only to the visual. Then I have page level filters. I can go back and drag and drop the region now in the page level filters. And now if I go back and change central, if I filter to central, both will be affected. Okay, make it easy, both will be affected. Okay, so that's why we call it a page level filter. All the reports within the same page will be filtered. Okay, then I can have something. But remember, if I have a report on a different page, it will not be filtered. So in a different page, if I go back and place a region and sales, see how it will not be filtered. Okay, so although I'm filtering by central and east here in the page 2, I'm not filtering by central and east, but it's a page level filter. Okay, finally, if you want to implement that, you can implement something called a report level filter. Okay, I can remove the page level filter, and then I can take the region report level filter, which means all the pages in that report will basically have that filter. And here I can go ahead and include central and west, and see in the first page, obviously it will be filtered because the report level filter. If you go to the second page also, you will see that in this particular section, it will be highlighted. Okay, it will also be filtered here, and report level filter will appear in this page also. The third page, it will be here. Fourth page, it will be here. So that is what we call a report level filter. Okay, and finally we call it a drill through feature, which you can use a drill through feature to basically work on drill through reports. So what you can do is, let's say you have a scenario where you have categories. So instead of region, if let's say I have categories here, and I can build another use case in page 2. Let's say I have a scenario where I have subcategories. Okay, so here I'm having subcategories and categories, of course. Let's say categories, subcategories, and I'm looking at category and subcategory by sales. Okay, very simple report I'm looking at. It's a detailed view I'm looking at. So I can configure a drill through filter. So the idea is that if I right click on a particular category, I should be able to see subcategories of only that particular category. So in that particular case, I can go back and configure drill through filter. Okay, and again you can mention where, let's say, use case could be if I want to click on a particular report, I want to navigate to another page, and I want to see subcategories in that particular page. Those are scenarios where you will basically configure drill reports. Well, one other thing that I must mention to all of you here is there'll be certain use cases, there'll be certain scenarios where people will, I did mention the clause drill through reports, remember? Okay, just to quickly mention how, again, just to clarify how you configure it, remember, one thing you must remember is the filter is something that you don't place here. Okay, the filter should always be placed in the page where you're configuring. So if you're configuring this page, the category filter should be placed here. Okay, remember I'm filtering by category, right? What am I trying to do? I'll click on a category here, and based on that, I'll set a category here. So the idea is that you're going to filter on the category in this particular page. So you should always place category in the drill through section in this particular page. And now we go to page 1, and if you right click on that technology, you will see an option for drill through. Okay, you will see an option for drill through to page 2. And when you do that, you will see only technology getting filtered. And once that happens, you will automatically see that in the drill through filter section, category technology is automatically filtered. Remember, guys, it's a very recent evolution. It's not exactly again, drill through filters typically was not part of the filters panel even a few months back. It's again came very recently, and it's again a very new feature, but it's always a very, very useful feature, because drill through reports is something that if you work across other tools, enterprise reporting tools, it's a very common feature where you click on a particular item and you want to go to another page where you're filtered with that particular item. Okay, and this is a very, very useful case, right? It's a very, very useful scenario where it enables you to do that, right? So you can not only configure stuff in one page, but you can actually configure stuff in another page. Another very common scenario, another very common use case for this could be that it could be initial introduction page, right? The initial introduction page could be like, you're showing the categories, right? You're showing all category information. You're showing technology, and you're basically showing all the categories, right? The categories of furniture, office supply, technology. So everything about the categories you're showing. And then you have page 2, and page 2 will actually consist of everything about the subcategories, right? It is a subcategory page. It is a subcategory page for the category that you selected. And page 3 could be the product page for the product that you've selected from the subcategory, essentially from the subcategory related. Okay, so I can further build another page. I can further build another page. And guys, remember, this need not be a table. Okay, this could be anything else. This could also, and by the way, it need not be your category also. This could be anything else. This could even be a bar chart. Okay, I'm just giving a table as an example, but this could be a visual. It could be one visual, it could be multiple visuals. You could also have a pie chart here. Okay, I can do a Control-C, Control-V. I can build a pie chart here, and you could build any kind of visual. But remember, the concept is that whatever subcategories you see, so I'll call this subcategory page, and that is basically my initial category page. And I can further build one more page called the product page. The product page is where I'll probably have detailed information. I probably can build a bar chart here also, where I'll get my product IDs, or my product names in the values axis, sales. Probably I can sort this data, sort by sales. So I'm showing my highest sales up on top. Okay, and here I'm going to go ahead and sort this information by subcategory. So I can go back and sort this subcategory. So what I'll do is I'll take the subcategory and put it in drill through filters here. Okay, so now remember, category, this page I have no filters. So because that's my main page, there's nothing to be applied. Everything about my categories. There's a subcategory page where I have everything about my subcategory. Here, obviously, I've selected a category, so that is filtered out. But then further, I can go back and select my product from here. Okay, so the idea is that you navigate from here. So you want to go drill through, you want to go to subcategory. Okay, so I'm looking at a particular category. I want to know more about the category. So go to subcategory. Show me more about furniture. Now, whatever you're seeing right now is about furniture, right? You're seeing all the top categories in furniture. You're seeing all the subcategories in furniture. Now, interestingly, you see furnishings not done that well. Okay, so furnishings is kind of a laggard. You want to see what's happening in furnishings. So you want to click on that. And now you want to go to drill through in product. You want to see all the products of that particular subcategory. And that's how you get to see all the products of that particular subcategory. Okay, so that's the idea of drill through filter. Again, is a very, very important concept, very, very powerful feature in PowerBI, and it's very important to mention that. Okay, so those are the main types of filters that you have in PowerBI desktop. Content and apps, I think I covered that already. So let's get to that right now. DAX, very, very important, guys, and obviously DAX is a functional language, very important piece in the overall Power BI desktop stack. Remember, in Power BI, whenever we talk about Power BI, and something that you guys will anyways mention when you talk about the components, obviously you guys talked about Power BI. There was an instance that I actually wrote a custom column. I actually added a custom column a while back. Okay, remember that cost column I added where I write a very simple expression called sales minus profit. So the language behind the scenes that's been written is called M code. Okay, so This is called M code. So Power Query is equivalent to M, whereas Power Pivot is equivalent to DAX. Okay, the underlying language that you use in Power Pivot is DAX, whereas the underlying language that you write in Power Query is essentially called M. And just to give you a very, very brief flavor of M, what it is, and if you go to edit queries here, remember all these queries are nothing but a combination of steps. And if you want to look at just a brief idea of what is M, go to View, go to Advanced Editor, and you can take a look at the M query syntax here. Okay, that's the M query syntax that gets highlighted for you here. So remember, this is existing in query editor, whereas Power Pivot is something, DAX is something that exists in Power Pivot. So where do you see DAX? You can go to the modeling tab, or you can just enter the modeling from here. You can go to new column and you can just start typing in your DAX queries here. Okay, we'll look at more about some of these examples just in a bit, but this is where you actually start typing in DAX. Okay, at a very simple level, I can say sum of sales. I'm creating a very, very simple calculated column here, and that is how you basically build DAX queries. Okay, I'll go back and just delete it. So very important, guys, when you asked about DAX, it could be a very generic question, but it's very important just to not be theoretical. It's very important that you mention a couple of things like it's a functional language and give some examples of how DAX is related to stuff that you can do in the Power Pivot, that is in the data model. And essentially it helps you add more meaning to your data, because your underlying data could be in a certain format, but there are certain kinds of calculations, a certain kind of complex measures that you want to add, which could only be done in the Power Pivot layer and nowhere else. Okay, and we'll look at some examples of this just in a bit, of certain things that you can do only in the Power Pivot layer and nowhere else. You can't do that stuff in the ETL layer. Okay, might sound surprising, but I'll just show you some examples of why that is the case. Okay, these are some of the common DAX functions, and again this kind of goes hand in hand with the 9th question. So when you're asked about DAX, just mention some of the functions. Again, this goes to show the length and breadth of your overall knowledge of DAX, because any kind of job interviews on Power BI, DAX is an integral component, because people expect you to be good in DAX, right? Because it's not all about visualization. It's not all about point and click on a visual, you get a visual, knowing the underlying features, which is fine. But people do expect you to understand the DAX queries very, very well. And not only DAX, even at some level, the M query language also you need to be good at least a basic understanding, so that if there are errors, able to do some debugging, at least you're able to pinpoint on those issues. Okay, filter function, it goes hand in hand to calculate basically, and this is again a very, very important component in Power BI desktop, and something that you will use a lot. And whether you know any other function or not, this is one function that you have to know and have to understand. Okay, calculate function basically operates in the filter context. I'll just briefly explain to you what this is and what are some of the use cases behind using it. So what I will do here is I'll create a very simple table. So what I have here is an example where, let's say I have year. Okay, so I have year information. I'll take order date and I'll take sales information. Okay, so I'm seeing a bar chart. I'll convert this to a table, and right now what you're seeing is a very nice tabular information. Right now, what I want to know is a percentage. Okay, so let's say the scenario is that I need to know, okay, right now what I'm thinking is the total sales across the total absolute value of sales, right? But what if I want to quickly figure out the percentage of the total? So for instance, right now you're looking at quarter wise, or maybe another good example will be taking subcategory. Instead of taking order, let's take subcategory. Okay. So right now what you're seeing is across different subcategories. But what if you want to know what is the total percentage of paper sales compared to total? So right now you're seeing absolute values. How do you convert it to percentage? And the way to do that is using a calculate function. Okay. So you can't just divide this by total. So conceptually it's very easy, right? So you'll take this number, you'll divide by this. So you'll take 107532, you'll divide by this. Okay, just expand it, go to the focus mode. Now I hope you can see the numbers correctly now. So 203,412.73 divided by 297. So you're dividing each of the row values by the every step of the process, right? To calculate the percentage. Okay, and that is something you can do using the calculate function. You build a DAX calculated column here. Okay, there are some lot of cool ways of doing it, and again there are some pretty cool ways of doing it manually without creating DAX. So you can go to show value as, you can actually say first of grand total. So this is the easy way of building it. But remember, even when you're doing this, behind the scenes, Power BI is implementing the DAX for you. Okay, there is also another revolutionary feature called measures. So again, there are some lot of new things that you have in Power BI, something called quick measures that you can also implement. But again, remember, whenever you're doing any of this stuff behind the scenes, you are implementing DAX. Okay, you have some new quick measures. If I go to new quick measures, I'll see a ton of stuff that I can build in Power BI. Okay, you can just take a look at this now. And you can see a ton of stuff that you can do here. Okay, and again, there are a lot of these things tend to be added from time to time. New things tend to be released. You can see time intelligence calculations, totals, running totals, star rating. Really cool thing, star rating. It's an amazing feature. So you can actually give a star rating, highest value. Let's say my highest value is going to be something like 250,000. I'll probably say. Okay, that's my highest value. That's my lowest value. I can give the number of stars, and I can enter a new quick measure called star rating. Okay? And now you can see behind the scenes I've actually got DAX. So whatever you're seeing right now is actually a pretty complicated version of DAX. Okay, so whenever you create quick measures, these default point and click options behind the scenes, Power BI is actually building that DAX for you. Okay? It's actually pretty complicated of DAX that's written, and the final output is actually pretty neat. Okay, you can see that that's my star rating column I've created, and you can see that that's the top value, 5 stars here, 4 stars here, 1 star here. It's pretty depending on the data, and the best part is that it's actually going to be dynamic. And what do I mean by dynamic? What I mean by dynamic is that this value will change depending on the underlying data. So essentially, if you take subcategory and if you further try to break it by region, that data will actually change. Now your stars will actually adjust based on the underlying dynamic of data. Okay, and now you can see nothing about 5 stars. Everything's like 2 stars, 3 stars, because the maximum dimension is no one's reaching that other than the total, obviously. Okay, so what I want to highlight again is that behind the scenes, although you can do this solve this particular problem in a very, very simple manner, but behind the scenes, Power BI will always write a DAX for you. So coming back to the underlying question once again, so I'm looking at my individual sales values and I want to calculate the percentage of it. So if I want to write a DAX formula for this, the way to write would be to go back and implement it manually using the calculated column option. And I quickly go ahead and open up the result and find in a quick bit of DAX here. So how do I do that? I go to the modeling tab and I go to new column, click on new column, because that is actually going to be a new measure. That's going to be a new measure. And just in one of the upcoming questions, I talk a little bit about what is the measure and what is the column. Okay, this is a very, very important difference by the way between the two. So here's a measure I'll create, and the measure is going to be called, let's say, sales percentage. I'm going to sales percentage, and let me quickly type in the measure. I'm going to take the sum of sales, and I'm going to divide it by what? I'm going to divide it by the calculate of the sum of sales. I'm going to divide it by the calculate of the sum of sales. And here I'm going to apply what I call the filter context. Okay, and so this is the important part. This is the key part. And okay, so whenever you use the calculate really has 2 arguments, and as you observe, whenever you start typing any function in DAX, it has a pretty nice kind of auto completion or a help suggestion wizard that comes up. It tells you that, hey, what are the arguments that I need to enter in calculate? It very clearly tells me that the arguments I need to enter is expression. Expression is the stuff I want to calculate, which is obviously going to be sum of sales. That is what I want to calculate. Sum of sales is the underlying expression, and then I have to get the filter context. Okay, you get the filter. It's an expression in a context modified by the filter. And this is the important part. So remember, when I am performing this operation, I should ideally not have any filters, right? Conceptually think about it. When I'm performing this operation, ideally I should not have any filters, and that's exactly what you're going to set here in this particular example. So you're going to set this up in such a way that you don't have any filters. Let me go ahead and quickly set this up now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and give all. So when I say all, I'm specifically telling Power BI that, hey, no matter what filter context is applied on that particular row, you're ignoring everything. Okay, and I'm going to take all of orders. Okay, I'm going to consider all of orders, and I'm just going to go ahead and close my parenthesis here. Okay, I'm just putting the brackets here. Let me go ahead and quickly edit the syntax. So whenever you make an incorrect syntax, what happens is it'll give you this red squigglies, which will highlight that. Okay, so syntax is not right. As you can see, that's my DAX one right now. And just to clarify once again, calculate. The way we are using calculate is we're calculating sum of sales as the first argument, and the calculate sum of sales based on the filter context of all orders. Okay, that is where you mentioned filter context. So you're saying that I will calculate the total sales irrespective of the filters applied. So I'm taking all of orders. So you're dividing individual rows by the total. That is the underlying meaning of this. Okay, and I can actually go and multiply that with 100 just to add clarity on this whole formula. So because it's a percentage, I'll just multiply that by 100 overall. And now I can go ahead and add that piece of code right into my table and see the results. Okay, as you can see, I was very easy to achieve that using a very simple piece of DAX code involving calculate. Okay, so this is just one use case of how you use calculate. Very important DAX formula, calculate and filters, and something that gets asked all the time in interviews. Okay, and the best part about this is dynamic. So see how I've used a category here. If you want to use something else, let's say you use a region, you can do that as well. So I'll take a region, I'll remove the subcategory, and see how the entire formula adjusts automatically depending on the kind of calculation you're using. Okay, kind of grouping you're doing. And you see the region percentage is highlighted. Everything adds up to 100%, and it comes up pretty nicely overall. If you don't like region, if you want to further split it by segment, you can go ahead and split it further by segment. Let's see how again the entire calculation gets dynamically adjusted. Okay, and this is again the beauty of measures. Okay, this is again the beauty of measures, which the very fact that measures are dynamic in nature. It is dynamic in nature, and it will basically adjust every time you change any of the visuals, change anything, filter anything. Your measures will always recalculate. Okay, and measures are always created with a small calculator icon. Okay? What are the benefits of using variables in DAX? And variables in DAX are no different from variables in any other programming language. Obviously, DAX is another kind of functional language. So variables, one of the most important use cases is that it can be reused multiple times so as to avoid any kind of duplication or redundancy in your overall code, right? There's some other examples that we have on. You can specify what are some of the time intelligence functions. Again, calculate is something you can use for this. So we talked about calculate, all, and filter, and you can obviously use them in multiple ways to go ahead and create n number of different use cases. Okay, this is one use case I mentioned, but you can obviously use calculate to create trailing next month metrics via DAX. Okay, it's a non-standard calendar, for instance. Okay, and you can see what we are doing here as a second step is using all again to remove existing filters. Okay, remember the concept of all is you're still applying the filter context, but the only difference is what you're saying is you're removing all the filters. Okay, what is the calculated column in Power BI and why would you use them? And this is the part where I talk a little bit about calculated columns. And an example that I will show you guys here is related to, let's say, profit percentage. So what I will do here is I have a measure that I created. I'll go back and delete it. So I have a cost column. What I do is I'll build a calculated column. So you build calculated columns using the new column option. You build measures in the new measure option. So I can build calculated columns in this option here, and column name will be profit percentage. What is the formula for profit percentage? It is going to be profit by. I think I selected the wrong table. Okay, so yeah, so one problem that happens is, and just to, I think, let me this error. So one thing that happens is when you create a calculate column, remember that you're clicking on the table. So basically, I'm trying to create a column on this table, and I'm not able to find the profit column because obviously it doesn't exist in my bonds table. So obviously, I'm trying to create a table, a column in the wrong table. Okay, so I'll go back and delete that from here. So ideally, the profit percentage should be created in my orders table, right? So I'll go to my orders table, just click on it once, and that should pretty much be enough to click that and click on new column. Now click on new column, and that means that now that particular column is now, so you can see that that's now a part of my orders table. Okay, it by default comes with column name or column, but I can absolutely go and change it to something like profit percentage. And profit percentage is going to be profit. And now when I start typing profit, you see automatically profit will come up. Orders of profit, that's the basic syntax that is applied. So orders is my table name and profit is the column. So that is profit by cost. That's my percentage profit percent, right? So profit by 60 into 100. So if I calculate column, everything looks okay up to this point. And what I'll also do is additionally I'll also create a measure. Okay, additionally I'll also create a measure. Conceptually, there is a lot of difference, but syntax wise there is very little difference. So what I will do is I'll create something exactly similar. Only difference is I call it profit percentage measure. See, all I did is I copy pasted the entire formula. So this is the measure, and the only other thing I have to do for measures is I have to aggregate. So that is the only other additional syntax difference in measures, that I have to pre-aggregate my fields in measures. Okay, because without aggregations, measures have no meaning inherently. So that is what I'm going to do. Oh, sorry, one small thing I have to change. So 100 is basically from outside the sum. That's my measure. So what I have is a profit percentage calculated column and the profit percentage measure. You can see the difference in icons. Now, conceptually, what is the difference? There is actually a lot. And as an example, if I show you region, and if I basically want to know what is my profit percentage across different regions, if I just try to see the profit percentage in calculated columns, look at my number. Is that even a valid number? I mean, 300,000 percentage. Is that a total profit percent? Answer is wrong. That is absolutely incorrect data. Okay, so even if I want to look at this data across in an annual level across different segments, you see the same problem. I get very, very big numbers, which is definitely something wrong with my data. But the moment I take something like the measure, if I take that measure here, everything is perfect. Okay, things look perfect now. Okay, the measure is giving me the right result, whereas this is giving me the wrong result. And why is that so? And that is basically the key difference, the key conceptual difference between a calculated column and a measure. Okay, I'll come to the performance aspect when to use what. And obviously, when you answer this question on measures and calculated columns, performance aspect is also very important. But you should always start with the conceptual difference first. What is the conceptual difference? What is actually happening in the model? And what is actually happening in the model is when you look at the calculated column, all that it is doing is it is basically summing this up. It is actually aggregating all the data that is already there in the model. Okay? In other words, when you go back to the model and look at the orders table, if you just scroll over to the right, you will see that profit percentage is actually calculated and stored for every single row in my model itself. Okay, so whatever column you're looking at the end here, profit percentage is basically a calculated column that has been calculated for every single instance of the row. Okay, and that is stored in my model. So all that I'm doing in the table is I'm aggregating all these values together, which is obviously incorrect, right? So essentially, what it means is if I look at row number, let's say if I look at row number 1, 2, if I look at all the 20 rows here, we are all Western. Okay, essentially what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to add all these profit percentage values for West. Okay, just like doing a group by region and sum of profit percentage is obviously incorrect. Okay, it's obviously incorrect. And if you look at my table, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm actually doing a sum of profit percentage across all those, which is actually incorrect. Okay. So that is the problem, that is the key problem, and that is exactly what you need to fix here. Okay, and even if you try to do a average of profit percentage, you might be wondering, okay, so obviously if I try to do a sum of profit percentage, I'll get a problem. So why don't I just go back here and change this to average? Even by doing this, you'll get incorrect output. Okay, you will get incorrect output even if you do this. This is not the right way of building it. Okay, the right way of building this is to actually do it using measures. Okay, and that is exactly what I want to highlight here. And the other thing that you would have observed is in measures, they're actually not stored in the model. Measures are always calculated dynamically on the fly. Measures are never stored in your model. Okay, your model calculates the value of the calculated column and it stores them on a row by row basis in the model, but it never stores the value of your measures. Measures are always calculated dynamically on the fly. Okay, so if you just look at this particular example here, you can see these measures are always recalculated. So when I go back and remove segment, those measures are actually getting recalculated on the fly. Okay, so I'm actually recalculating them on the fly. If I just go back and take something else, let's say instead of region, if I just go back and take a category, it's actually getting recalculated. Okay? So that is an important thing about measures that you should keep in mind. Okay, and that's the other reason why when you build a measure, you can just see that in measures, because they are not calculated on the fly, because they're actually not stored in my model, you have to define the aggregations here. Okay, they're calculated dynamically based on whatever filters you apply, whatever stuff you do, they're always calculated dynamically. Okay, and they're responsive to filters. That is the other important thing. They are responsive to filters. Okay, so for instance, if I go back and put some filters here, let's say I'm looking at category and I can actually first split it by subcategories. Okay, and now if I go back and put some filters, let's say I go back region, I'll put some page level filters here for region, and if I look at the central data, you'll see that now there's many filters. Okay, they're actually very responsive to filters as well, generally. Okay, and they're recalculating every time you're changing anything in your data. They're recalculating based on the aggregation that you have defined. Okay, so a couple of key things that you have to keep in mind when you talk about measures. A is they're not stored in your model. B is they are dynamic. They're always calculated on the fly dynamically as and when you're building your visuals. And C is obviously they're particularly useful for calculating any kind of data which is pertaining to percentages or anything that represents any kind of denominator. Okay, so divisions particularly are a very common use case where you use measures. Divisions are where calculated columns will fail all the time. Okay, imagine building something like this in your query level. Okay, you cannot build a visualization like that in query layer. Okay, so for instance, if you try to perform this profit percentage calculation row by row, it will not work. Okay, it will not work. And in this kind of scenarios where you have some kind of percentages, some kind of denominator, some kind of division involved, which always use measures. Okay, and again, measures should use complex calculations. And the other really powerful aspect of measures is that, and as I mentioned in the slides here, as you can see that here, calculated columns are not compressed and they consume more memory. And the reason why they consume more memory is because, as I said, they're stored in the model. And this is where again measures win out. Okay, measures win because measures are actually they're not stored anywhere. Okay, it's more dynamic. They're not stored anywhere. They get storage. And but the obvious disadvantage of measures is that because they're not stored anywhere, because they're dynamic, because they're calculated ad hoc on fly, they probably put more strain in resources, right? So it'll probably take more time to evaluate. So as of today, the differences are hardly you'll hardly feel it. It's almost negligible because some of the performance improvements are taking place, but generally they'll give roughly the same performance. But still, measures do take a little lesser time comparatively because, as I said, just put more resources. As you can see, the last point I mentioned is they can also reduce processing and refresh performance if applied on large fact tables and can make a model more difficult to maintain or support. Okay, given that the calculated column is not present in the source system, that is another important point you should keep in mind. PowerPivot, I think I spent a lot of time already on PowerPivot discussing the components at a very high level already. But when you ask the question, what is PowerPivot, it's very, very important to link it with DAX. So again, it is a discussion on one of the components of Power BI. So I think it would be really appreciated if you all could just spend like a minute to go over what is Power BI, talk about the self-service aspect, talk a little bit about some of the components of Power BI, and then come to talk about PowerPivot. And the fact that it's the modeling layer, the fact that your X velocity in memory corner tables that you're maintaining, and essentially that's the layer that you actually build DAX, calculate columns and DAX measures in Power BI. Okay? So mention those pieces along with that. Another thing that I want to mention is the data model. Quickly, data model obviously is the model that you're building after you're performing the query editing and all that stuff. At least that you're loading all your stuff into is what we call data model. And data model consists of tables, and obviously tables are consisting of columns and rows, and essentially you have relationships. Okay, these are key aspects of a data model. And just to briefly explain this whole piece to you, and what I'll do here is I will be connecting to my Excel once again, and I'll just be bringing in one more table. So what I'll be doing here is I'll be quickly going ahead and connecting to my Excel and bringing in one more table called returns, just to demonstrate to you guys what is a relationship and how to quickly relationship. And you can see the same process, and the only difference I'm going to bring in these two tables, keep and returns together. Okay, I'm just going to directly load them. You can see processing queries, and I've loaded that into my model right now. It is loading my data. So this is a step where I'm loading my calculating connection, loading data model, these steps. And I have to make a small change. Actually, I go to edit queries, and my data is actually not the right shape. So I need to go back to returns, and a quick thing I'll change here. Let's go ahead and make this first row as headers. You can see headers are not in the first row. Very simply, the operation to perform. Go back to people and convert that to first headers. I'm not really using bonds, so I'll just go back and remove bonds. I'll just delete the bonds and close them in place. Okay, so what I have the end result is I have three tables. Remember, in query editor they're called queries. The moment you load it into the model that is PowerPivot, we call them tables. Okay, so everything is a table now. And if you go back to the tables tab, you see the three tables that are present here. Obviously, orders, people, and returns. And if you go to the relationships tab, you can actually see the relationships. Okay, so Power BI will do a pretty decent job in automatically creating relationships based on columns. So if there are two similar columns, Power BI will automatically relate them, but they will not do a very good job on this. Okay, so for instance, here you can see region and region are automatically related. Just double click on the relationship tab and you can see the relationship, region related. You can see the types of relationships, finality, many to one to many, standard relationship types, and it's an active relationship. That's something you can turn on and off. Okay. And also XC path returns, you're not able to relate, let's go and manually do it. Or ID, just it's as simple as a drag and drop, and now you've related orders and returns. So it is very important to build relationship guys, and it's always consideration that you always have to decide whether you want to keep everything in one table or you want to keep things in separate tables. And it's always a very key question that you might get. So at what level do you decide should you normalize further? At what level do you decide? So that's a very tricky question, and I think there's no easy answer to that, but it really depends. Just like so many other things, it really depends on a lot of different scenarios because you can decide to have everything in one table. So for instance, if you look at this particular use case, you can decide to have orders, people, and regions, returns all in a single table. Okay, you can just go to query editor to merge queries. You can just join all these three together and have everything in one denormalized table. Things are good, but the obvious disadvantage is that it's going to be a big table, it's going to take a lot of space, and that's not a good thing. Okay, and on the contrary, you can keep them separate tables, but the obvious problem will be that because the relationships are there. Whenever you're trying to query data across, when you're trying to visualize something across three different tables, it's going to take a little bit more time compared to when you're trying to do it in one table. Okay, so there are obvious pros and cons to both approaches, but it's important to understand the relationship are very important. And mostly Power BI, as I said, you will mostly have these normalized scenarios where you typically have a lot of these split out tables, and you'll typically have to combine with relationships. Okay, and why is relationships important? Because without relationships, you cannot visualize data across multiple tables. So for instance, if orders here, people here, returns here, and you go to my visualization layer now, I can opt to see sales by the you can see sales selected from the orders table. I can go to the people table. I can visualize that by person. Okay, I can actually visualize that by person. I selected fields from two completely different tables, and I can actually filter that whole stuff by the return status. Okay, pretty cool, isn't it? And this is something I could not have done this if I have not related the tables. So you can see the visualization that I have here. I selected fields across three different tables, and this was possible only because I related the tables. If I have not related the tables, for instance, if I have not related my tables, you just go back and remove the relationship here. If I make them dependent tables without any relationship, you can see that it will give the same values. At times, Power BI will give an error like this, and at times it will actually go back and say the same value. Okay, so that's an important thing to remember and understand exactly why relationships are required. And these are some scenarios that you should actually point out when you talk about data model and what is PowerPivot and when you talk more about relationships. Okay, so the X-velocity memory analytics engine is something I talked about. That's basically the underlying engine behind PowerPivot. That's something that drives PowerPivot. It can handle a huge amount of data because at the underlying layer, it is nothing but a columnar database. Okay, it stores data in columnar databases, and the columnar database, as some of you may know, is a very special kind of database which is optimized for storing huge amounts of data, and overall data access is very fast in the columnar database. It doesn't maintain data in a relational database format where data is stored in rows and columns typically the way we understand it, but columnar database is a very special way of storing data. And I'll let you if you want to look at it more, and if you can stress a little bit more on columnar database when you talk about this particular concept, just spend a little bit of time talking about what is a columnar database, because as I said, everything about PowerPivot and the in-memory engine of PowerPivot is based on columnar database. So to talk about columnar database, mention a bit about what it is, and if you can continue those aspects of why data is fast, why access is fast, something like that, but it's not required. That's very much advanced aspect, but it's not required, but it's an optional thing that you can take on. Relationships, obviously, there's an option that you can set. You can either have one active relationship, have multiple active relationships. Obviously, two relationship types here. One very, very common use case of this will be order dates. The date thing. Okay, can have order date, ship date, due date, and a very, very common use case of this is especially if you're dealing with role-playing dimensions. And it's a very, very common scenario that you mentioned. Role-playing dimensions is a term that you mentioned where you can only have one active relationship. Okay, very important to mention that, guys. With role-playing dimension, you can only have one active relationship. Okay, how do you make a relationship inactive? So we talked about that already. Let's say region related here. It's a solid line. Let's double click on that and you can make a relationship inactive. Click on OK, and that is an active relationship. PowerBI, I think I spent a lot of time on this already. So needless to say, when you talk about PowerBI, you mentioned a couple of key terms: ETL tool, chaining, cleansing, transforming data. Very, very important because I also mentioned the mQuery bit. That every query is a combination of steps, and you build multiple queries, and ultimately the underlying layer you're writing input. Okay. Query forwarding is actually another very, very important feature in PowerBI, and obviously it's more of a performance enhancement question that can get asked. Very, very important question actually that sometimes tends to get asked here from a performance automation standpoint. And query forwarding basically leads to the fact that the data operations that you can perform at the source get transferred to the source. Okay. So at a very basic level, you see there's something called view native query. There will be something called view native query that you will see. So let's quickly go ahead and get some data from SQL Server here. We'll quickly try to pull some data from SQL Server. I think this is also the first time that you're seeing how can we connect to a SQL Server. So the dot as my server name, and I connect out to my local instance. I have a database Adventure Box as a demo. So I connect to my Adventure Box database, and here I go and connect to, let's say, dim customer, or let's go and connect to product. Okay, and there goes my SQL Server table. And if I try to add in some columns here, let's say what I'll do is I'll try to remove all this stuff. Okay, try to remove all the stuff that I have here. Remove columns. Obviously, the thing that doesn't work as expected. Just like as the other steps are already created, I'm going to remove all this stuff here. I don't need this. So I get only 3 columns. And what I can do here is further thing I can actually add columns. The idea here is to show you something called view native query. And what happens here is that I've actually got data into PowerBI. I connected to my SQL Server, I got it into PowerBI desktop. And after that, whatever transformation I perform this within PowerBI desktop. Okay, so whatever transformation I did within PowerBI desktop. But using query forwarding, PowerBI will actually transfer that operation to my source. So what is my source? My source is my SQL Server. So instead of performing this operation within PowerBI, that is, instead of performing this in memory inside PowerBI, I will be performing this in database. Okay, so you're transferring in memory option to an in database operation. Now that stuff will be performed in your database, that is in your SQL Server, and the resultant will be returned. So if you just go to right click on that, go to view native query, you can see that this is the resultant stuff that will be returned from my underlying table from my database. Okay, it's a very powerful feature, and what it means is that when you're actually getting the data to PowerBI, you're not going to get all those 50 columns, right? If you need only 3 columns, then PowerBI will bring in only those 3 columns. And actually, as I said, it's very, very powerful feature. And it not only works with removing columns, you actually go back and remove columns, and you can see that this here also view native query, I actually get the name as alias gets applied. Okay, so I'll give some different name like color name. I think it's we'll call it. Let's just go to product name. Okay, here we'll call it product ID. So actually rename all my columns here. As you understand, in a statistical language, when you rename a column, you're always actually applying alias. And again, as you can see, although this step I'm performing within PowerBI desktop, PowerBI desktop is quite an offload that operation or transfer that operation back to the source of the SQL. So if you go to native query, you can actually check that. Okay, I guess a very, very important piece that you should keep in mind. If you try to do a split here, let's say I try to do a split here, split by area. Okay, and say I want to split this by a space, and click on OK. And see how I split that stuff. And if I click on this, now you will see that view native query is disabled because in the native SQL language, in native SQL Server, this operation is not supported. So up to a certain point, you can do query folding, but beyond a certain point, you can't do query folding. That is not important to keep in mind. So if you perform any transformation in query editor, for which query folding is not possible, or if view native query will be kicked out in that case, and obviously that means that at the native database layer, that particular operation is not supported. That's another important thing to keep in mind. Okay. What about count transformation? So a very, very important question that might get asked at times because just to test your basic level of knowledge, changing data is very trouble. Will do it always, all the time. Another thing that I will add is adding a header row to basically modify header rows. Filtering rows is another very useful thing. Typically, if you're connected to Excel data, some kind of CSV sources, initially rows might just be give, might just have merge cells, some kind of images, some kind of introduction, headers, all those stuff, and always filter out rows initially. Columns, such an important thing. You don't see all those columns, right? If you have 50 columns, you don't really care about. Just your 3 or 4 columns are very important option. Grouping, aggregations, again, very important. Splitting another very common transformation you might want to use. Okay, like some some characters based on which will split the columns out, subset something out. So very, very important option. Adding new columns, needless to say, is something that you do all the time, right? As SQL and PowerBI used together, I understand this question, this example here, answer is absolutely yes, you can. And the best place you want to do, you can do is the graphical user interface, or you can directly type your query. You can straight away type a SQL query here, more customized SQL query across multiple tables. What query parameters? Query parameters are a very, very important topic in PowerBI. And query parameters, the whole idea is that they're very similar to filters, but they are more dynamic sort of filters. And the way you set them is using parameters here. I will back to my orders query item, go to manage parameters and set a new parameter called region. So I actually define a parameter like this, the region parameter. I is going to be text type. Okay, this values is going to be, let's say I'm going to give a list of values. And when you say any, basically you get a text box, and if you give a list of values, you get a drop down. That's the only difference. I'll show you both examples. Okay, current values default you can give actually I put them central. Right, so my region parameter set up here. And now what I can do is I can go to my orders table and see how I can filter by region here. I can query, I can go here and filter by region. I can directly type out the value here. Instead of doing this, what I can do is I can go to filters, I can say equals, and here I can go back and select the specific parameter type. Okay, and this is really the amazing thing about parameters. So now instead of saying equals to a particular region, instead of typing out a value here, I can go back and say it is equal to the parameter region. Okay, so now the filter is actually equal to the parameter region. Okay, and what is the parameter region equal to? Remember the parameter region equal to central. So now that central parameter is central, and that is why it is filtered on central. Okay, if you go to the region, you see it is filtered on central. Right? And it's very easy to change it by the way. Go to edit parameters, go to edit here, and see that text box comes up. First the list is any, it's actually the text box actually considered something else that's east, and I see automatically going to change it to east. Okay, that's a real beauty of the parameter memory. Just to go and click on that interface once to put it to reflect. Just refresh it once for it to reflect, and now you see it reflects east. Go and set it as west. Let's go and set it as west. And go back to orders now. You should be able to see that now the entire thing is automatically filtered. So you can see how dynamic the whole thing is. And remember, it's not only at the query level. In the visualization layer, using parameters, when you actually load this query in, you can straight away go edit parameters. So something very similar to what we're seeing here, you see in the visualization layer also. You will see in the modeling tab. So here, you see the parameter section coming up here, where you can go ahead and directly modify your parameters straight away from the visual stuff. And one other important thing is the other use case where this is actually required. And question that we're asking here is PowerBI templates. The other thing that you all mentioned. What is the use case of this? As I mentioned, the use case of this, one very common use case of this is you don't want to load all your data, right? So if you have data for all the 4 different regions, central, east, west, and south, you don't want to load all your data, right? You can have hundreds and thousands of data. You don't really care about all your data, right? If you want to look at data only for west, then you want to select west. You want to select only for east, you want to select only east, right? But what you don't want to do is you don't want to select all your data. You want to get all your data into PowerBI desktop, and then you want to filter. There are 2 options, right? One option is to include all your data, do all your data, and then put a filter. The other option is first you pick the user prompt, and based on whatever option they select in the prompt, you go back and load it up. And the second option is obviously the parameter approach, which is preferred anyway, because you're loading in only the requisite amount of data that you require. You're not loading in any additional data. And the best part about the second approach is, as I said, you're loading in only the amount of data that's required. Obviously, the amount of data that's loading is very, very less, and obviously the performance will be much better. So another common use case is with dates, right? So if you have data for the last 10 years, and you don't care about that 10 years data, right? So you care about only data for the last months, you always give people a filter option, or in this case, filter them in parameters. Right? So you configure filters parameters, and now get people get a prompt with them. When they open the dashboard, they get a prompt, and when they want to view the dashboard, they actually do filter it. Actually put the prompt level, and now depending on what enter, data will be filtered, and from the source, only that data for the last 3 months will be picked up. Okay? So that's the use case of parameters and how parameters are different from the normal standalone filters. Related languages in PowerBI, we talked about it already, 𝐸_code, and it's very important to also mention a bit background when you ask this question. There's a bit of background on what's PowerBI. Why do we need PowerBI and PowerBI import data from most resources? And I think this also has been answered before. I've talked about this as well previously, but it's also important when we get this question to give some context on what is PowerBI and what is PowerBI. And essentially mention the part that although yes, you can get data in PowerBI, but it's also very, very important that you address the part that it's PowerBI is easier to. Okay, PowerBI is not an easier tool. PowerBI is only used for loading data model. That's it. I mean, essentially PowerBI can only be used for calculations and analysis. Okay, the whole point of PowerBI is analytics. Okay, it's not for data cleansing. Okay, if you want to perform data cleansing, that is not PowerBI's role. So the two adding components, the two tools have two very different roles, and that's the thing to bring out in this particular question. For maps, obviously the mapping interface of PowerBI. So I'll just going to briefly focus a bit on this particular piece. Obviously, maps are extremely powerful in Power BI desktop. And if you just go to the maps section, one very, very important thing guys you have to keep in mind is when you're configuring, especially working with maps, is to set the correct geographical type. So if you go to modeling, you have data category, something called data category. It is very, very important that when you inherently have data like city, it is very important that you go to data category and set this as a city. Okay, extremely important that especially when you're working with map data, you have to set this as geographical data type. And when you do that, highlight here is the concept of setting geographical types correctly, because this again, when you try to visualize this data finally in maps, it just ensures that you're more accurately able to represent data. Remember, Power BI will do a pretty good job in understanding exactly what a particular thing is. So if it's a city name, if it's Delhi, Bangalore, Mumbai, Power BI knows it is a city. So you don't have to specifically tell it's a city. But remember, if it's something that Power BI is not able to perfectly recognize, in certain cases it will be very, very useful, because remember, the column names are not always going to be exactly what you're seeing right now. Although it's recommended that you use proper column names, but that may not be the case. And again, the underlying data may not be exactly what Power BI is able to recognize. So those kind of scenarios is very helpful if you set data categories accurately. Remember, even if you don't set it properly, Power BI will still display your data properly. Okay, but then there are certain use cases where it will not come accurately. Okay, and I can go ahead and represent this in a map. And all I have to do is just take my country, I'll take my state, I'll look at my city, and see how Power BI is not able to do it the best way all the time. So sometimes it will fail, and I'll represent this data based on sales. So sales is basically going to be my size, let's say. Okay, I can further do a color saturation based on sales. Okay, I can look at this data across, and now you're seeing, right? And you might be wondering what's exactly happening. Why am I only seeing Western United States? And the reason is because if you remember, I have filters applied. So the underlying model that I've taken, I have filters applied based on parameters. Okay, and again, that is something I can further configure within Power BI. Okay, just to quickly clarify this once again, where do you set the edit parameters? Remember, parameters is something I applied just a while back, and you can further look at the visualization layer. You can further go to edit queries, go to edit parameters. You don't have to open edit queries, just go back here and set it as east or west or central, whatever you want to set. This is east now, click on OK, and you will see now this whole thing will automatically go ahead and convert to east. Okay, you have to apply the changes, because remember, we're actually doing is a query level change. So idea is that when you set this as east, it will go back to the query, it'll take all your data, it'll take your eastern data, and now it will show you only the eastern data. Okay, so that's the idea now. Now it will see only showing you eastern data. You can further go to edit queries. Now you're going to see the central data. Just type in central here, and now you're going to see only central data. Okay, so apply changes for the filter to actually go back to the source and get only the relevant central data. And this is the part where I mentioned that at every point in time, you're prompting the user. And again, it's a very, very good performance optimization technique that you can use, especially when you're dealing with very, very large data sets. Okay, few of these things I've already talked about. These are a few additional questions that we have: Power View, Power BI Designer, Can we refresh our reports, Power BI reports? This is an important question. Again, this is related to scheduled refresh. Scenarios are, you will want to refresh your data, right? You will want to typically have a schedule, and when you're publishing your data on the cloud or a dataset section, you basically have an option for scheduled refresh, and this is exactly where you can go ahead and set up your refreshes specifically for the kind of data that you have. And you need something called a gateway. Right now, my gateway is not configured, but you need something called a gateway to set up a scheduled refresh. Remember, if you are connecting to an on-premise source, especially a SQL Server database or something like that, on-premise source, then you need to have a gateway. And you can actually download your gateway from here to configure it further, right? And you can also go to the Manage Gateways tab to basically go and manage your gateway. So if you already have a gateway installed and you want to go back and set your gateway specifically, so this is one other place where you can go back and check your gateway. Everything's working fine there. Okay, so it's important that you mention a couple of these things, that obviously, yes, you can refresh. There is something called schedule refresh, and also mention about gateways. Gateways are that they are the interface between the cloud and the on-premise world. Okay, so gateways are what allows you to transfer your data from on-premise sources to your Azure cloud, where your cloud server, that's the Power BI service, is hosted. What are the different types of refreshing data? Package refresh, model refresh, tile refresh, and visual container refresh. So this is another important question. So typically when we talk about refreshes, how many ways can you refresh? The package refresh is basically the concept wherein, let's say you have a Power BI desktop file or an Excel file, which you have in the service. And I mean, obviously the same file is there in OneDrive or SharePoint Online, and you want to ensure that they are both synced. Essentially, whatever data you have here, you have there, and vice versa. And that is something you do using what we call package refresh. Okay, that ensures that whatever files you have in your Power BI service is exactly in sync with what you have in the OneDrive or SharePoint Online. Remember, it is not going to pull data from your source. It's not like the typical kind of refresh that you're thinking. So that is basically going to be the model or data refresh. So the refresh that you're thinking, or the refresh that I showed you here, is basically the model or data refresh. Okay, this is basically what we call the model or data refresh. Okay, that is what you do using refresh now or schedule refresh. Okay, then we have something called tile refresh, which is something that we can go to the different dashboards, and as we all understand in dashboards, whatever stuff that you see, remember these are just views of the underlying reports. Okay, and you can just click on the tiles and it will take you to the underlying report. So dashboards are nothing but cache sheet views of the underlying reports, which typically get refreshed every 15 minutes or so. Okay, but if you want to specifically refresh a tile, you can go back and say refresh dashboard tiles. Okay, that is how you refresh the dashboard views to reflect according to the data changes, which anyways get refreshed every 15 minutes. Okay, those are the types of views refreshes that you have. Is available on premises? Answer is absolutely yes. And when you answer this question, it's also very, very important for you to specifically mention about the gateways, and also to talk a little bit about the kinds of sources that it can connect to. Okay, remember, for Power BI to connect to cloud sources, it doesn't need a gateway. So if you have something living on Azure, if you have something living on an online service, you do not need a gateway. If you have something living in SharePoint Online or OneDrive, you do not need a gateway. Okay, so even if you want to perform a scheduled refresh, you don't need a gateway. So gateways are only required if you want to connect onto on-premise source, either to perform a scheduled refresh or to get data directly from a direct query. Okay, which is nothing but a live connection essentially. What is Power BI Q&A? And Power BI Q&A, as I briefly showed you sometime initially in the discussion, was it's a natural language querying tool. So you can just type in queries and essentially it just gives you results on the fly. It's not that intelligent right now. Remember, it's still a very, very preview feature. It's a feature under constant development, but it's fairly accurate. It's pretty good overall. And there's a lot of artificial intelligence built in overall there in how the tool performs, especially in the app. And I don't know if you guys have used just do take some time. It may not be an interview question, obviously, but take some time out to explore this on the Power BI app. And in Power BI app, they rolled out a feature called conversational Q&A. Okay, so here is a standard Q&A, but if you use the app, they have something called conversational Q&A, where it is just like as if you're having conversation with Google Assistant or Siri, something like that. Just like you're having a conversation, asking them, hey, what is the sales? And they'll go back and respond something. And then you can just go back and carry on the conversation from there. You don't have to type in a new question every time. Okay, you can just carry on the conversation, just like having a conversation with a friend. It's pretty cool feature overall. And remember, this feature is there as in the service, but it is there in the desktop as a preview feature, which is something you should also mention. Okay, so what are the ways Excel experience can be leveraged with Power BI? And there are a couple of things that we can do in Excel, by the way, which I wanted to briefly talk about. And just to discuss about this piece, what I want to do is I just quickly open up Excel. So there are two things particularly that you have in Excel. So one thing we call the Power BI Publisher for Excel. obviously the personal gateway and the on-premise gateway, the gateways that we have. But there's one additional component that is worth mentioning called Analyze in Excel updates. As you can see, there's something called Analyze in Excel updates. So these are both add-ins that you have to install in Excel. So Analyze in Excel allows you to go back and analyze a data set in Power BI from within Excel. Okay, so if you have a data set in Power BI service, just go ahead, click on it. Okay, you can click on it and you can basically just say Analyze in Excel. And when you do that, basically you download a file, you download an ODC file. ODC file basically stands for Office Data Connection File. Just going to show you what that Office Data Connection File is and how it looks like. So this is what an ODC file looks like. Okay, if you guys see my screen right now, you will see that it's an Office Data Connection File. Okay, it's an ODC file. Right click, go to Properties, you will see it's an ODC file. Okay, and now what I can do is I can directly just double click on it and it will open up within Excel and it will straight away open up in the Power Pivot interface. Okay, what I did was I took data from the data sets in Power BI service and I'm analyzing that straight away within Excel and see how it opens up. Okay, that's my orders table and see how it comes up now. Remember, in my original service also I had only the orders table. Okay, so now I'm looking at the same orders table and I'm analyzing that table within my familiar table interface. Okay, fine. So this is a great feature that we have in the Power BI. The overall interaction and overall the interaction you have in Excel and Power BI is just phenomenal generally. Okay, and all these things tend to be included. A lot of these things are happening where there's more interactivity that's been built in, but the overall concept is that the integration has to be seamless between both environments, right? So very clearly take it from service from Power BI to Excel and Excel to Power BI and vice versa. So that's the seamless integration that exists right now between these two tools. So right now we have learned how we can get something from the service onto the Excel, but the other way around, from Excel to the service, essentially from Excel to Power BI, how you do that. And for that you need something called Power BI Publisher for Excel, which I have already added as an add-in. And remember, again, for this you need to go ahead and sign into your service. I can just go ahead and publish now, and all it's doing is spin it. So usually I can print to my dashboard. Just basically example AAA, like go ahead and pick my existing dashboard, and it's published. It's pinned to my dashboard now. And if I go back to the service, I look at my demo, I can see that AAA is now open. I can see how seamless integration is and how these two environments, Power BI and Excel, are talking to each other. Okay, so it's very, very important that you mention some of these use cases examples, and if you do that, you can highlight some of these things. It will be really appreciated and just giving a real answer. So give some of these examples and use cases on the board. Okay, these Excel I added. I spent a lot of time discussing this, so do mention some very, very brief about all these different tools that you have. How data security embedded in Power BI is actually a very, very important question, especially with potential level security, unless as you call it. Okay, and the way you do that in Power BI is using the concept for roles. Okay, so you first select desktop. So for instance, right now here you can see I have one of the first things I'll do probably here is remove that parameter. Okay, I'll go ahead and remove that parameter. Okay, it's being referenced by the query, so I can't remove obviously. So I'll go ahead and first go ahead and quickly remove the filter, and now go ahead and remove the parameter. Okay, and close on the apply. What I'm looking at right now is obviously the entire data because I have no filters applied. So everything's perfect. I can go to manage roles, and the way I do this is using something called manage roles. Okay, so if you go to the modeling tab, you see something called manage roles in security. Go to manage roles, and here you have an option to set roles. Okay, so what I will do is I will want to create separate roles for separate people, right? So let's say it's a big company that I have as I operate, and I have different people from different regions. I have central people, I have eastern region people, I have western region people. So central region people should not be able to look at data for eastern region people, right? If you belong to central region, if you're a manager for central region, you don't care about eastern region or western region, right? So it could be confidential data or whatever use case, but you only want to focus on data which is central. So what I will do in that case, I will basically create roles. I will create what I call a central role, and I will create what I call an eastern role. And the next step I want to do is write some basic tags. And what I will do is I go ahead and type in a quick expression. I'm going to say region is equal to central. And remember, this is the role I'm setting for central role. The tag filter expression is always going to be filter expression, and the result always has to be a true or false, right? So this will be region equal to central. And for the remaining, so I'm going to hit save. And for eastern, I'm going to put as region is equal to eastern. Okay, see how I set two different roles here. One is for the central role. So if anyone is viewing it from the central region, this particular filter will be applied by default. And if anyone is viewing it from the eastern region, this particular filter will be applied by default. Okay, click on save. And now the tags have been configured. Okay, one way you can preview this feature is by clicking on view role as well. A good way to do this is just go ahead and put some additional information. Let's say I have a region here, and a region by sales and profits mentioned here, just to put some clarity on the exact data that you're seeing. And now if I go back and click on view roles as or view as roles, this is where you can preview your stuff. Okay, that how the central people will view this. They're looking at only central data, and how the eastern people will view this. Now they're looking at only eastern data. Okay, so this is how you can see that stop viewing an option will come up. You're actually viewing it as a role of these roles. As a developer, you can preview exactly what people will see in your dashboard. Okay, so it's a very, very important feature. Now all this is good. So all that you have done right now is you've implemented this in the desktop. How do we publish it out? So obviously you already have publishing. So all you do is obviously save it first. And I'm going to publish it out, save it in a file. So remember to obviously implement this service, you publish it first. So right now just click on desktop. So the first is I have to publish it. So I will publish my workspace. So replace because it's another data set with the same name already there. So by default replace because they both the same names, right? And once I do that, so I have my source now, and go to data set now, and go to manage security. There's a security section here, and here you should be able to add usage the roles present here. Okay, this is where you can basically now go ahead and add the email addresses of all the people. And remember, this further will be linked to AD groups, right? Because remember your configure, it depends on the admin settings, how you set it and all that. But basically you can type email addresses of all those people who are belong to the east role, and email addresses of all the people who belong to the central role. If anyone who is in the eastern role and they try to view your dashboard, they will basically be looking at only eastern data because I said that filter region equal to east. And if anyone who is belonging to the central role is trying to view your dashboard, they will look at only central data. Okay, and that depends on what email addresses you enter here. Okay, so as an administrator, you can basically go and enter all this stuff. And that is how you have a very, very simple layer to implement row-level security. Remember, I've done it at a very simplistic level, but this could be a far more complex expression. So you can come back here and you probably have far more complex expression. I guess that has to be put in by as the end product. Power BI does support mobile, so there is a Power BI mobile app which is supported across multiple platforms. And many relationships are something that's another very, very important point that it gets asked a lot. So does it support many relationship? Answer is actually no. It only supports one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-one. But many-to-many, if you implement using what we call bridge. Okay, so that's something to specifically replicate or create either in the model or in the Power Query. So first create that bridge table. a one to many to many to one. A very good example could be authors and books. One author can write many books. One book can be written by many authors. Or doctors and patients, also a very good example. One doctor has treated multiple patients, and one patient has been treated by multiple doctors. In both these cases, you have to create a bridge table. Okay, and then you will set up the one to many relationships